Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Once again, my name's David Hatchell. I head up the IoT and Industrial Control System practice over here at CrowdStrike. And I'm really thrilled to be talking to you all today on our Crowdcast with our special partners, Rockwell and Dragos, covering kind of the topic of how as an industry we kind of reconcile cyber risk of this area in the not just the digital transformation area we're all facing now, but specifically around the industrial area and how this takes place within our manufacturing environments and the other verticals that this impacts. So joining me today, I have some wonderful guest speakers joining me. First of all, from Rockwell, Tony Baker manages up the product security operations for Rockwell. Tony's had a long background within Rockwell Automation, from working in designing architectures within Rockwell around their process control environments, all the way up to his current role in managing the security operations at this time. Joining me also is Matt Cowell, who heads up this business development for Dragos. Matt has a background in process control in the engineering side, but also working in the security aspect as well from his background at Phoenix Contact, where we kind of collaborated together into his current role at Dragos. And joining me also is Matt Russell from CrowdStrike, who is the director of our strategic threat advisory services. And Matt's background is both from the defense and the Army background, looking at threat intelligence, all the way up to educating people in the private sector on this. Today, Matt speaks with a lot of our customers in this area around some of the TTP'S and the intelligence that we kind of view in this area. So very, very pleased to have all three of these people online. We have a wonderful collaboration, just kind of highlighting is between Rockwell Automation and working in CrowdStrike together, working both as Rockwell as a customer, but also working on these types of issues as we look forward to facing the public in these areas. With Dragos specifically, we have a partnership with Dragos between CrowdStrike and Dragos, which allows us to combine a lot of the different indicators of the threat intelligence that they look for that kind of spread into the OT and the ICS area. And we have kind of what we call a store app that customers are able to consume that intelligence from it. Also, we partner on incident response between the OT and the IT areas. So we've learned a lot of lessons learned here, which I will be sharing with you today. Okay, so today we've got about hours worth of a session here we're going to kind of cover, and I think kind of to start, we're going to kind of talk about the overall digital transformation landscape from Rockwell's perspective. What does this mean? Let's kind of set the table for how this applies in a cyber area. Then we'll talk about the threats, specifically as Dragos sees it within the digital transformation area. And then as well, we'll kind of move to, from our perspective at CrowdStrike, how we see the broad-based sector of manufacturing in this area and the specific actors that are targeting this area and what this means for you. We'll then kind of go to a panel discussion, kind of talking about some of the trends and tactics that we'll kind of talk through in this area. And then finally, we'll do some question and answers. Please know there's a Q&A button that you'll be able to kind of submit your questions to this. And so about the last 15 minutes, we'll start kind of addressing those questions and answers. So please feel free to jump in with anything that any of these presenters can cover. And so to kind of provide a little bit of an overview of kind of some of these discussion topics as we think of this world of industrial security, I've been in this space myself for about 10 years, on all sides of the fence, from working with CSOs around how they kind of develop a strategy for their process control in kind of the early days, to working on the product security side, as well, kind of developing a network detection response product along with the oil and gas super major to build into their kind of incident response process as they kind of built this in their area. Working with Rockwell in my past life around as a supplier to Rockwell. And so I've had a really interesting perspective on this landscape in the past 10 years. And so what I'm going to just talk about a little bit is just kind of where we were yesterday, kind of where we are today, and where this is going. And so, as a as in kind of yesterday's world, and we'll call it ICS, as in Industrial Control System Security world, a lot of our focus has been on how we kind of approach this from the network level, right? So from classic segmentation to gaining visibility into these networks has been a lot of the big challenge. So I think we've done a very successful job at building with kind of what we call our zones and conduits in these plant environments to build the segmentation, to kind of restrict access, between the HMI and the PLC level, and really think methodically through how we approach that. But the vulnerability aspect of this has been very interesting. From as we gain visibility into these environments, we can then start looking at some of the vulnerabilities at which the ICS cert might publish, or we see in common Windows operating systems we started having to explore, all the way up through what we see is like the Ripple 20 recent impact, where we see a TCP/IP stack, from a major real-time operating system vendor that's supplying equipment to ICS vendors. We start having to think through the vulnerability management process of that, and really just start thinking of a governance model, like from the plant people, how do we approach this? And so what we do really well in the plant world is understand how to recover. And so in the NIST framework, looking at the recover aspect of that, it's a wonderful way to kind of approach a governance model, kind of in between IT and OT, as we start thinking through that, how we can recover from that process, either manually or digitally, and then start building a framework of how to collaborate around that. And then from that governance model, we just start thinking, how we kind of build the IT and OT convergence from that. A lot of these systems really design this kind of heterogeneous world, where essentially many different systems, many proprietary protocols, and so as an attack surface is extremely complex. In the old days, the attackers didn't really have to, they didn't have a lot of skill sets really to kind of approach this and penetrate their way from the business network into the OT network and attack that. And so, we've seen the threat landscape, the old days of physical, of USB access to like the Australian sewage system attack, where we saw, physical access that a contractor had that was able to, wind up and flood 800,000 gallons onto golf courses because of his continued access into from the physical area. And so the ecosystem has been somewhere in between kind of the plant and then the supplier. And so the automation vendors like Rockwell and so forth have had a very tight relationship with their customers and a wonderful channel that's able to kind of bring the security to these different areas. And so kind of in today's world, because of the different kind of threat landscape we've seen, the increase in ransomware and the increase in targeted attacks, which we'll talk about kind of momentarily, the IT world has been involved significantly in this. The governance model has matured. The CSO is involved in this. The ERP team has started to think through this as the combination of manufacturing execution systems and ERP kind of start coming together. So generally kind of what we've seen is, a lot of the focus on, how we look at the overall supply chain beyond just kind of the automation vendor aspect. And then what's that mean in kind of a technology perspective is how we kind of look at, the endpoints and identity from this. Because of some of the threat landscapes we have seen, the escalation of privileges and the identity kind of in between the plant and the IT side becomes very interesting. It's the most targeted vector we see in this area, where a lot of times, and I think Dragos mentioned this in their year-end report, which is really interesting, most of the times, about 45% of the time, there's a shared identity between the plant and the IT side, which can easily be exploited. And so we think about this from the endpoint side a lot, from the ransomware impact to have the ability to respond and recover from the endpoint side. And so really this comes to how we, the end users and the IT side start kind of building this into a systemic process and build this in what we call the security orchestration, automation, and response. Thinking through the greater governance decisions of where this responsibility should reside. What area does the IT and the SOC side have? Should that be outsourced and kind of managed by a specific OT SOC? So this brings up a lot of discussions, and then also specifically as a pain point where we are as far as integration of tool sets to kind of provide this almost kind of top 10 approach. We can kind of go, threat hunt against, looking for the targeted attacks we see, or looking for the specific vulnerabilities we kind of see now that we have visibility into the plant. And so where this is going to go tomorrow, as we see this kind of industrial Internet of Things or digital transformation, but this starts kind of moving from beyond just the areas of predictive maintenance and kind of workforce augmentation to kind of full digital transformation of kind of integrating workflows into digital processes, pushing things like 5G down to the edge to reduce latency in the plants and provide full analytics to this. This creates a whole new attack surface, as we see in the cloud providers, of how we look at things like we look at on the IT side, from traditional denial of service to the identity and the insider as part of this landscape. And so it opens up a whole new threat landscape to consider, at which a lot of times from the people side, kind of what we see is just chief security officers then starting to have these discussions. The CIO is looking at this from digital transformation, and sometimes these worlds intersect, and sometimes they don't. And I think as an industry, we need to do a better job of working through that, of how we understand this attack surface and communicate this with the business to allow some of these wonderful issues to occur. So that's a lot of the topic for today. I'm very pleased to have all the presenters here. I would now like to turn it over to Tony Baker from Rockwell to give us kind of an overview of what digital transformation means, from an industry perspective as we think through this. So, Tony, please take it away.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the opportunity to kind of to talk with you today. Digital transformation is obviously a key topic amongst leaders and thought leaders across the industry today. It really provides a means to innovate how we go to market, how we achieve new efficiencies in operations, demand planning, supply chain, how we engage talent. So there's tremendous opportunity here for many different businesses at many different levels. When we look at digital transformation, the unique perspectives that can be gained at each level of the organization continue to be very exciting. Whether you're looking at individual plants or systems, whether you're looking at a combination of assets within your organization, or even if you're collaborating with your partners, looking at things across an industry, across a particular segment, working with partners, maybe even working and collaborating with competitors to make sure that your demand, your supply chain, your enterprise risk is being managed effectively. So digital transformation provides a lot of capability. Unfortunately, a lot of people focus only on the technology element of it. Data management, data governance are key critical components to the success of realizing this true digital transformation opportunity. Digital transformation isn't just a singular goal. It's really a new means of doing business, a new means of operating. And if you really want to drive that value, you really need to understand the processes and the governance in which you're going to make this and implement this within your organization. The value of digital transformation is really dependent on the type of business at hand. Sometimes it means cost savings. If you're a pharmaceutical company, it might mean finding ways to eliminate waste, to eliminate things like excess production costs. For others, it really goes into improve productivity. How can I produce more widgets? How can I do that with the resources or the machines that I already have? And others, it's customer satisfaction. How can I get goods to my customers of a diverse set in a very fast time frame? How do I make sure my customers are happy? So value is not universal. Value is specific to the business, and it's important to understand that. When we work with our customers, a lot of the outcomes that we typically talk to are faster time to market, operational productivity, enterprise risk management, asset management and reliability. We've worked with a number of leading organizations that are further along in their transformation journey. And as we've consulted with them and our partners, we see a lot of value in four we'll call it 4 particular use cases. If we focus on these 4 use cases, typically we're seeing 80 to 90% of the value of digital transformation coming out immediately. And really, when we look at that, it's in intelligent production control, reliable operations, digital quality, and connected workers. When we think about intelligent production control, we think about how can we quickly build, deploy, and operationalize technologies? How can we look at demand planning and make it real time? How can we look at improving the reliability of our systems to make sure that we're producing good products and we're reducing yield for bad? And more importantly than ever, managing the workforce and the talent within our organizations. Our companies continue to grow. The technology we use becomes more complex. Managing the knowledge of our workers and enabling them to be more effective at their job is a huge barrier for all of us to be successful. And so when we work with our customers, we typically focus on those 4 things. So, and really to help drive value in the near term. But, the purpose of today's slide or today's conversations is really to discuss the threats associated with this digital transformation journey. And one of the things that we typically realize is customers are unaware of what lies ahead and what those specific risks are. And sometimes that's because of where they are at in their digital maturity. When you're looking at digital maturity and you are new in your journey and you're looking at the transformations or the steps that you're taking along that transformation, security may not be as obvious. As you move into those higher levels, you start to see the requirements of additional connectivity, having the means of not only collecting the data, but aggregating that data, connecting it back to the people that can use it. So we start talking about use cases like edge to cloud, like David highlighted earlier, looking at ways for us to securely store that data. Data in decentralized pockets, may be of significantly less value than if it's compiled together into one particular space. That data, as it aggregates, becomes more valuable. It may become more critical for you to protect it and actually change classification to intellectual property because of the business intelligence that it yields. So understanding the importance of data management, data security is very important. Understanding the implications of connectivity, how to do that effectively, how to allow those connections to occur not only across your own sites, but maybe with third parties as you start to look at the higher level digital transformation use cases around supply chain. Sometimes it's not just working within your own walls. It's working with suppliers, it's working with other agencies and bringing that all together. And we even see customers now wanting to do real-time monitoring, real-time control of some of these larger level functions within their organization. And when they do that, again, it's yet again another step function in what that connectivity looks like. It's not sharing static data, it's real-time data, real-time connectivity. So each of these segments of digital transformation, looking at this holistically is critically important. And when we look at digital transformation, it's very important for us to appreciate the holistic approach that's required, realize that security is an element of that governance model, and for us to really derive that value and do it in a responsible way is extremely important. So this is more than technology. It's people, and specifically today, it's really around the process and the governance in which we manage the security of digital transformation. So there's lots to do, and I'm excited to talk to some of the implications of digital transformation and how we move forward.
Thank you, Tony. So my name is Matt Cowell. Appreciate everyone's time today. I want to take a few moments here to talk about the risks to manufacturing and the general manufacturing threat landscape from the Dragos side. If I have any issues with the slide advancement, please let me know. So did that advance to the first slide? I apologize. Okay. So what I want to talk through here is a little bit of the underlying risks to ICS through these digital transformation initiatives. So as Tony pointed out, there are a number of digital, it looks like I've advanced to a different slide here. Sorry, let me see if I can get that in here. There we go. So the digital transformation drivers, business drivers behind digital transformation are numerous, and Tony did a great job of outlining those. There's a lot of good business value to that. But what I want to identify here is that while there are legitimate business benefits, if you don't do digital transformation right, i.e. if you don't implement it in a most secure fashion, there are a lot of underlying risks already inherent in your industrial control systems that can be exploited for malicious intent. So let's talk through some of these points. So manufacturing environments contain a lot of different vendors, a lot of different industrial control systems. There's a lot of diverse technology, which means you're working with different vendors. There's a supply chain element to that. Different approaches are required for different detection and prevention. So you may need some endpoint collection. You may need some network level monitoring. There are a number of different approaches. Also, you have to deal with very long system life cycles. Most industrial equipment is designed, heavily engineered, and may be out of vendor support, may be running for 10 plus years, and you may end up with a lot of legacy equipment. And to quote a colleague of mine, you end up with forever day vulnerabilities. There are also very complex change requirements for these systems. They're heavily engineered. You can't make very ad hoc additions or configuration changes because you may have a negative impact to your operation. So there's generally a committee and stakeholders involved in that. Plus, you have to schedule those outages. Also, patching is very complicated. You know, I'm a big believer that you want to patch when you can, but in ICS, it's very different. You have vendor approvals that are into the mix. So if Microsoft releases a patch, you then have to wait for the vendor to approve that that's not going to break anything with that control system technology. You have to wait for scheduled outages to perform that. You need to know what patches apply to your systems. And sometimes if they're third-party modules, it's very difficult to do that. Also, you have to address, does that patching mitigate the risk overall? And that brings me to my next point, which is insecure by design. This is a term often used by Dale Peterson. I think he coined that term, where it's referring to the fact that the underlying technology and the protocols that industrial systems use lack basic security functions, such as authentication and hashing, for example, which means that there isn't really a desire or a need for an adversary to use a vulnerability. They can just use the standard features that are available. Also, it's a bit of a generalization, but ICS, by and large, has very large flat networks, poor segmentation, and if an adversary gets access to one, they ultimately get access to everything. Combine that with insufficient monitoring. We haven't seen a lot of log aggregation and collection in environments. So that means that adversaries can use these native capabilities and hide in plain sight for extended periods, which means we also, as a community, lack forensics and general intel. Also, downtime. Downtime is significant. It's a main driver in operations, and you want to minimize your unplanned outages to make necessary changes, but you also want to tie any security metrics to the manufacturing metrics that exist, your OEE metrics, your overall equipment effectiveness, such as availability, performance, and quality. And obviously, safety concerns could impact all of those as well as safety. But ultimately, what this means is you end up with this increased attack surface. You have these underlying risks. You're making this technology more available for your distributed workforce or remote connectivity, and that's something that adversaries can use for malicious intent. So let's talk about the threats to manufacturing. And I just want to pivot back. I'm not saying that digital transformation is bad. You just have to be aware of the underlying risks and the threats associated with that. So first, let's talk about what we mean by manufacturing. It's a very broad term, and I recognize that. I'm sure as an audience, there's a lot of different manufacturing variances here. But you end up with underlying technology. There's a lot of consistency throughout, whether it's discrete and process manufacturing. And if we start on the threats to manufacturing, on the right-hand side, what we initially saw is that there was a lot of untargeted impact by ransomware. E-criminals that had written malware to typically leverage the MS-1710 vulnerabilities, and given that ICS had minimal patching or behind-the-time patching as well as poor segmentation, that enabled that ransomware to impact ICS in an unexpected manner. That's kind of evolved, and I think we've learned a lot of lessons from that. So I want to spend most of my time talking about the targeted threats. Those are the ones that I think concern me the most and keep me up at night. On the targeted side, there are activity groups that target ICS. We refer to them as adversary groups. There's currently over 12 adversary groups that Dragos is tracking, and they have specific intent or motivation to target ICS. And they often leverage internet-connected ICS, so either connecting through enterprise, maybe a spear phishing attack and getting in that way, or they even maybe try to leverage existing remote telemetry or connections between the vendor and that equipment for health check and remote support capabilities. We've also seen, though, a little bit more of that targeting on the e-criminal side. So what we refer to, or what the industry is referred to as big game hunting, using that ransomware approach, but now targeting big corporate enterprises to now try to maximize their return, their revenue, the monetization of that downtime, of which we've seen mixed results. You've also got the obvious insider threat. That is very hard to detect and very hard to control, but you obviously want to make sure that you have sufficient controls of least privilege across the team and monitoring and so on. But ultimately, what I want to get to here is the impact to manufacturing. Oftentimes in enterprise attacks, it's loss of data, confidentiality. There might be some regulatory violations as well. But the impact to manufacturing is a little bit different. First of all, there's lost credibility. Not to quote anyone recently, but there have been a number of high-profile cases, which I'm sure results in a very noisy PR engagement for those companies when they do suffer a high-profile ransomware attack. There's obviously the financial concerns as well, the financial impact to operations. And if you are ending up paying ransomware or you're just paying for remediation in general, you're going to be out of pocket by an extensive amount. And then there's obviously the more long-term effects, the espionage and the intellectual property theft that may occur. And in some cases, many cases of IR cases that we've worked, we've seen that adversaries remain on networks for well over a year, so completely undetected, and who knows what level of reconnaissance and data they were able to consume with that. Moving further into the severity side, there's obviously disruption to operations, actually impacting your ability to produce and manufacture the components or product that you're responsible for. But then more importantly, safety concerns. And this is one that got highlighted heavily through the Triton malware that was produced or authored by an adversary group we refer to as Xenotime. This is now the capability of leverage that physical process, putting it into an unsafe state that it could cause an explosion and ultimately loss of life and injury. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a great segue for everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. So what we're going to talk about is kind of leveraging the CrowdStrike visibility into data to kind of understand the broader scope, kind of 60,000-foot view of some of the big trends that we've seen in the industry, right? So to piggyback on Matt, talking about those targeted intrusions, at CrowdStrike, we delineate targeted intrusions. Generally, we consider it to be nation-state threats, right? In 2019, all of the nation-state targeted intrusions that we saw came from Chinese-linked actors. The last time that we actually saw another actor was, I believe, 2018 with a Vietnamese actor, Ocean Buffalo, that did some activities in a South Korean auto manufacturer. But the Chinese threat actor in the manufacturing sector is a very real and a very sort of enduring threat. As part of their overall political and economic strategy, they have made the determination that sometimes it's easier to take what other people have made and make that your own rather than go through that R&D process, which is makes the manufacturing industry right targets for that. But in addition to that, when we look at the sum total of attacks that have started to, just ramp up in volume, pace, and velocity from 2019 through 2020, we're seeing a massive uptick in e-crime actors and specifically in the big game hunting. As Matt mentioned, that's sort of these larger, more targeted attacks where it's not just, hey, here's a 9 million emails that go out, somebody might click on something. These are actors that are taking a little bit more time to make these attacks a little bit more crafted. Maybe it's a better spearfish. Maybe it's whaling going after those executives. And then the criminal enabling services. So something like Mummy Spider has Emotet, right, which is a downloader. And then as these criminal undergrounds start to become more collaborative, more communicative, and work together, use a consulting word here, more synergistically, right? So Wizard Spider that runs the Ryuk ransomware and TrickBot, they're often seen leveraging mummy spiders, Emotet, and their access in order to gain a foothold in those networks. And rather than having to go and start from ground zero, they talk to their criminal buddies, and they say, hey, you're in this business. We'd like to leverage your existing access to drop our malware in there. And because these e-crime ecosystems and these underground communities are becoming more collaborative, it's really ramping up the success of these attacks as well. It allows these criminals to specialize and really work on their craft. So rather than having to do 10 things mediocre, they're able to do 1 or 2 things really well. Business email compromise and email thread hijacking are also a couple of things that we've noticed pretty heavily. The email thread hijacking has been especially relevant in the COVID world because of the human element of being able to craft an email from a CEO that's talking about the all hands meeting in relation to COVID. Thinking as your end user employee, when you look at the landscape of emails, it's really easy to look at, in your user awareness training, oh, these are bad emails. But leveraging Emotet has a credential harvester as part of its package. And what it will do is spoof an email from the CEO or the COO. So it's really ramped up the success rate of those actors as well. Overall, what we've seen, though, is because of the interconnectivity of the manufacturing sector with other industries, especially related to in the defense industrial base and things of that nature, and in the post-COVID world, as other countries are looking to sort of bring manufacturing home, it's ramped up the Chinese threat in their ability to try to go out and capture some of that valuable IP data from those. But that being said, the volume of attacks from the e-crime actors is exponentially greater than that of our nation state targeted actors. And the vast majority that we've seen across the board, and specifically around in the manufacturing area, comes from e-crime actors. And one of the points that Matt made, and I know this is kind of hard to see, but I want to point out really the key piece here to take note of is these things in orange. And these are all valid accounts. And what Matt was talking about, these people are in these networks for up to a year, right? And they're able to do these things in those networks because they're leveraging valid accounts as their main TTP in this. With the post-COVID world, there's also a lot of places that have gone and switched to a more remote work environment, opening up a lot more RDP ports. Going back to Wizard Spider, I believe we saw it around March 15th, give or take a week or two. We saw them roll out a new module for their TrickBot malware that basically enumerated and brute forced RDP connections at scale. So as the threat landscape changes, as our world changes, as the dynamics of what we're doing as both business owners and business operators and security practitioners, the adversaries are very adept at changing. But again, understanding the way that these adversaries are doing this gives us a leg up in our ability to proactively defend against the specific threats of the actors that are actively targeting our business. And so with that, I'll pass it back to the team for a little bit more of a roundtable discussion.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to just take a few minutes here and just kind of ask a few questions of the presenters. So first of all, I'm going to kind of just start in kind of the new reality of COVID-19 as it applies to manufacturing, the digital transformation and threat landscape that we kind of see around it. Tony and Matt, from your perspective, what have we kind of noticed both in terms of in the manufacturing sector, what this has meant, and then how this has been from the threat landscape as well?
Sure, absolutely. With COVID, I think when we look at manufacturing, we look at industry, 3 shifts that we really see industry is looking at is really more flexible manufacturing. How can they really flex what they're doing to meet the demand? And this is a little different than the threat landscape. Obviously, we also see a lot more towards flexible workforces, and we also see more towards onshoring. So if we look at those 3 trends and we start to look at some of the risks that those expose, obviously flexible workforces is a very large thing that as a security professional I'm thinking a lot about. How are we bringing those individuals and giving them access to the tools, to the data, to the facilities that they need to do their jobs and keep plants up and running. So from a manufacturing perspective, that remote connectivity is obviously been a big shift. We've seen a lot of companies that have made it, that have made that transition very, very well. They're one of the more progressive ones, and they were ready to kind of surge and push through this current environment. The onshoring being more aligned to supply chain. A lot of our customers have seen impacts their supply chain around the inability to gather resources or goods, and they're having to restabilize their production by finding alternative means, by setting up new facilities, by building relationships in a very quick way. And again, it's the increased dynamic, it's the pace at which we work, it's and this new connectivity that brings it all together. What that has also meant, and I think it highlights a lot of what Matt just talked about, is we're seeing a lot of phishing emails, different types of engagements. People are vulnerable. They're in a position where they're being forced to act quickly, to respond quickly, and it's hard to balance that time to market, that reaction, and we're seeing people step in and leverage that.
Yeah, I would also add from the Dragos perspective, I mean, we've obviously seen an increase for our customers. Like they've essentially COVID forced remote operations, whether they had the capability before or they were investigating it. It really forced that timeline, obviously, to support more of a decentralized workforce. Nothing like a pandemic to really highlight the contingency planning or the lack thereof in your organization. But some of the things we've also seen is what a company is which company is defined as critical manufacturing. Hand sanitizer and face mask production companies were probably not considered critical manufacturing prior to COVID-19. Obviously, that changed things around. So I think a lot of companies are having to react and respond to that. And that means that adversaries are responding as well. We have absolutely seen an increase in adversaries targeting those remote access vehicles. Matt used some examples of password spraying across RDP and things like that. And those can be effective at autonomous or sort of ransomware-based, but also more intentional targeting from adversaries. So that means that ultimately the adversaries can increase the ways that they can get that initial access, what we consider kind of stage one of the ICS kill chain. And then with that, depending on their motivation, they can kind of go in a number of different directions. It's also meant that companies have had to rely and depend upon vendors to provide certain capabilities that maybe weren't existing before. And one of the things we've seen with some of the adversary groups we're tracking is that they've shifted their focus from the end user, but also to the OEM. So, the likes of any of the big industrial OEMs can now be a target as a vehicle to get into those final facilities. And so we've absolutely seen a reaction from our customers, but also a reaction from adversaries leveraging COVID-19.
Yeah, and Matt Russell, from the CrowdStrike perspective, I'm curious to get this because obviously we track in the deparameterization of this world and the use of kind of our endpoint intelligence. We've had some interesting observations. What does this mean in terms of the traditional actors that we track in this and some of their focus on these areas?
Yeah, so one of the actually interesting things that we've seen some of the e-crime actors start doing from a ransomware perspective that is a little bit of a shift sort of operationally is previously we saw a lot, they lock it up and they're waiting, hey, if you don't pay in a week, it goes up to this. Well, now they've sort of upped the game. And one of the trends we're seeing is that they're starting to, in conjunction with loading up their locker malware on there, they're also exfiltrating data and holding that data unencrypted on their side and leveraging that as a mechanism to incentivize their victims to pay out quicker or more. So rather than just you're going to be down, and this is especially relevant for manufacturing. At this point, things are so automated that switching to manual line operations is almost not cost effective. It's almost, just a better idea to shut down, right? So what they're doing is before it was like, okay, well, we can go through our technical controls, we can reboot, we can recover, we have our alternate sites, things of that nature. And you were able to make a technological based recovery. But with this sort of new TTP of, well, you pay the ransom or we're going to start releasing some of that data that kind of adds a whole new dimension to the ransomware game, and it's really it's kind of a game changer in the way that companies are going to be forced to respond to ransomware incidents going forward. And as we've seen, with the trend of e-crime just across the board, and the explosion in the number of attacks, the more successful, we say success begets success, and the more number of successful attacks and the larger number of payouts that we end up seeing, especially using these sort of data extortion schemes in conjunction with ransomware, is just going to continue to drive more and more actors into the space. And again, especially coupling that with the critical piece of, these manufacturing systems in 2020 are so heavily automated that there isn't an option to just, real quick, let's switch to a manual line operation. And so the numbers and the math and the financial impact, both from a brand and reputation perspective and an actual production perspective, and even to some degree, manufacturers that work in the defense and national defense space, producing aircraft and components, it really becomes a new dimension, and it becomes, your crown jewels are now not only vulnerable to the nation state threat trying to steal them to potentially, better their own defense or better their own internal things. Now you have the risk of e-criminals going out there and exposing your IP so that other competitors, once it's out there, it's kind of hard to bring that back in. So now you've gone from a purely nation state, we're going to improve ourselves threat, to now these people could potentially release our crown jewels and important IP to the public space. And it just really adds a whole new dimension to the way we need to approach the problem.
No, super, thanks. So I'm going to just ask one final question. I'm going to just get into a couple of Q&A here. So from a best practices and recommendations perspective, Matt Russell, I'll kind of start with you. Just how in general are we guiding kind of our customers, through the best practices against these adversaries? And then Matt Cowell and Tony, if I could just ask you to maybe just think through this from a ICS and an OT perspective of how we kind of adapt and tailor that to our world.
Sure. So I think, I'm going to say this is kind of a threefold response. I think the first thing is, from an intelligence perspective, we looked at that MITRE attack kind of breakdown, is really understanding who the adversaries are that are operating, right? If in 2019, all we saw are Chinese adversaries from a nation state perspective, maybe tracking a Russian spending time on adversaries that aren't actively targeting your industry, your vertical, what you're doing, it allows you to sort of narrow that scope and really start to hone in on the specific TTPs of those actors. So having a good base of intelligence and doing threat actor profiling, campaign tracking, and understanding at a very granular level how your internal security controls sort of map up and compare to the active TTPs that you're seeing in the wild, to build that foundational security is probably step one. Then over top of that, you have to, hands on keyboard have to fight hands on keyboard. So leveraging threat hunting as part of your overall security posture. Again, going back to Matt Cowell's point of, these actors are there living off the land for up to a year at a time, right? Obviously, there was a failure in our technological security controls, our automated, machine controls. And when we looked at the landscape, right, operating with valid credentials, that's kind of a big indicator. It's very hard for our automated solutions to stop things when you are using valid credentials. So having threat hunting enabled by good intelligence is kind of that second step. And then there's also, a very fundamental thing that we should all be doing that's always been a challenge, but vulnerability management. These attackers, if you have a good, especially from the enterprise IT side of things, those basic footholds, they're attackers that are going to go after those IoT devices, those ICS and those OT devices. They're not going to get in most cases through that necessarily. They're going in through the bigger perimeter. They're going through the bigger attack surface, right? So the basic hygiene of understanding what you have, where it is, and what it's about, really looking at the vulnerability management piece and making sure that you're up to date in your patch. They're just really foundational things. And then the last piece, I guess, would be really understanding the social aspect of it, because the weakest link in our security chain is always the end user. And really be understanding, again, this goes back to campaign tracking, understanding what are the themes that these actors are leveraging right now. Hey, we have intelligence that says actors are leveraging, spam emails with this as the subject line, or, you know, they're spoofing World Health Organization or whatever it is. But having good knowledge of what those things that are going to affect your end users and the weakest link in the security chain will, you know, you take all of those in combination together, and you have a really great foundation for kind of, you know, preventing things on the outside. And then, you know, Matt and Tony can talk to how do you do it, you know, on the inside in the more specific ICS SCADA type environment.
Yeah, so we will. Go ahead, guys. I think you highlighted the major thing we focus in OT and in ICS around the vulnerability management, visibility versus threat hunting and response. So yeah, perfect. I'd love to hear Matt and Tony's take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Matt said on the being proactive side. I would actually step back. You know, we see a lot of degrees of maturity across the customers in the manufacturing sector. Some are very well prepared and have established programs, some do not. So I would say first, before we start making any investments or justifying investments, whether it's technology or people, let's start to understand your maturity. There are a number of maturity models you can use, which not only help you evaluate where you're at, but also communicate that to the various stakeholders to justify those investments. That'll help you understand the gaps that you have today. You can also leverage your vendors and talk to them as well and understand what that direction looks like for you. The three consistent topics that come up, though: network segmentation. That's been a big component to the effectiveness or the proliferation of ransomware. So I would strongly recommend you start looking at your network level segmentation. I would also suggest that you try to explore what monitoring and forensics are available. And we refer to that as a collection management framework, understanding what log sources, what network architectures you have, what infrastructure you have to support the forensic analysis if you need it. And then that really ties into point 3, which is have a plan, have an incident response plan specifically. If you can get to that point, then you're in a really good spot. And then you can start exploring the value of proactive assessments. But having an incident response plan is essential when you are hit with ransomware and your production is down. That's a high pressure situation. It makes it a whole lot worse to create a plan under those dynamics than it would to have been proactive. Even if your IR plan is incomplete, at least you have something to go on. But obviously leveraging the vendors is important. So I'll pass over to Tony.
Yeah, I think, both Matt and Matt hit on a number of very important things. And when we talk to our customers, we see, as Matt noted, a lot of varying maturity levels. Many are concerned or have not yet rationalized what the risks truly are to their organization or what's most critical to protect. Obviously, the recent strings of malware or ransomware have really started to incite a lot of activity and interest, and we've seen a lot of movement with that as a directive. We've seen a lot of initiatives in companies specifically around minimizing the risk of ransomware because they've recognized that as an operational risk, something that prevents them from producing. And so it still feels like many in industry are waiting to be burnt or waiting to see activity to respond. They've not yet reached that proactive look that Matt Russell highlighted just yet. Just like what Matt Cowell highlighted, a lot of what we're recommending is good system design, making sure that you're reviewing your architectures, you're reviewing your technologies, you're looking at ways to implement things in an appropriate way, understanding that the life cycles of these systems are very long. And so as much as we all want to rip and replace and start with brand new products that may have the latest and greatest security features, there's always going to be a balance, and this concept of defense in depth is going to continue to be a long-standing principle that we have to live by. So I would say, in general, a lot of when we talk to customers, it's making sure that you understand, your system's design principles and that they are hardened and of good nature. And so, whether that's through risk assessments or doing design reviews, producing validated architectures, it's making sure that they understand the path that they should be on to have a good foundation to add new tools, new technologies, security monitoring capabilities. A lot of those things are much less effective without a good foundation to work on. And so we really work with customers on getting that foundation built and understanding where the greatest risks are. And once we've identified those risks, we can become much more pragmatic in how we want to approach it. And this is all really getting them on the path of having a more programmatic view of managing risk, not just throwing a project, not just throwing a technology at it, making sure that when you put something in place, it's sustainable. It's something that's going to last the test of time, that you have people that can support it, and that you have processes to, again, to keep it up to date and to keep it current. So I think a lot of it's building that foundation and then working with partners, whether it be CrowdStrike, Dragos, or whoever, to really bring in those additional controls and capabilities to bring it all together.
Oh, well said. Thank you. I'm gonna take a minute and just ask a couple questions, basically kind of proposed by the audience. I'm going to keep this anonymous in terms of who's asking it. I think this is a really good question that I do like. Given the increasing threat and the generally poor cybersecurity practices in ICS, how are companies justifying this type of digital transformation? Is it a case that they don't understand the risk, or they are accepting it, or something else? I think it's a really good question. I was talking with a CEO the other day who was, basically kind of telling me, look, I've got to make a 40%, increase in my overall IT budget in order to kind of accommodate some of the initiatives that I want to take on here. The risk I'm kind of taking on top of that is more like 80%. And so, a very interesting question. I'd be curious to get the panelist discussion points on this.
I'd say from my perspective, it's a conversation. I think there's always a risk. There's always an element of acceptance, because we know the space is constantly transforming. We know the capabilities of the threats out there continue to change. So there is a level of having comfort in knowing that your program is looking towards the future, understanding and communicating those risks so that you can adapt. I think the people that are accepting that risk know that this is going to be a continuous investment. It's not going to be we're going to set this up and walk away. And so risk acceptance is part of it, but it's also doing it with knowledge and education. I think that's where we start to see the change in mindset. And that's not specific to digital transformation. That's really around security and technology overall. I think digital transformation is really starting to enforce and emphasize, how well we have to do at this, or how well we have to do it.
Yeah, I think for the enterprise, so, it comes down to we're operating in a resource constrained environment, no matter what, whether that's people, money, time. We're in a resource constrained environment, and as businesses mature and they grow, and that resource pool expands across all those domains, the first and most important part of it, and where a vast majority of the regulatory concerns are on securing the sort of enterprise IT side of the house, right? And setting that foundation first, it sort of forces risk acceptance on the other side, and trying risk mitigation by investing heavily on the enterprise side. But to Tony's point, if you risk accept that and you consider some risk mitigation through your enterprise IT controls, building that plan, building that infrastructure, having that plan of, we do want to address this is in the future, and starting with that security first mindset as you build that out, as you look to start to make those ICS components of your overall security program more relevant. It's all a journey, and everybody gets there at a different time. But I think it's a hard sell to people to say, hey, we need $1 million to secure these pieces inside our environment, when there's still gaping holes, veritable gaping holes on the outside of it. So it's kind of a balance. But I think the most important part of that journey is really going to Tony's point. It's a lot easier to design security and a process and that foundation, build it out with a time frame and achieve that goal. But doing it from the start, planning from the start, is going to allow you a much greater level of success, at the end state, than it is to go back and try and inject security into that when it's already built from without including that in the overall process.
Fantastic, thanks. So I'm going to just ask one final question of the panel members, then we'll kind of close it out. Just kind of like to talk about the future a minute. We kind of talked a little bit about just in terms of the difference in attack surface between how the big game hunters, the e-crime actors are kind of looking at this from a ransomware perspective versus kind of the nation state adversaries that have, are kind of more of a data exfiltration and knowledge aspect. So if we kind of look at either those two as the kind of threat actors in the landscape, how do we see that evolving? What are we most concerned about as an industry from that? You, Tony, from a manufacturing perspective of how you kind of work with your customers to adjust their security assurance levels on standards like IEC 62443 to adjust the threat landscape they see. How do we see that evolving and what we're most concerned about in the future?
I think ransomware. I think when you look at ransomware and you look at some of the other threats that are out there, I think it's intellectual property. I think we're seeing again varying concerns about it. When you look at intellectual property right now, that's a big deal, right? We know there's a lot of activity happening around the world due to the pandemic, due to other things. We're seeing increased awareness around protecting intellectual property, particularly in pharma. So I think these threat levels change. The concerns, again, they're dynamic. When we look into the future, and we look at how do we communicate what is enough security, or how can we improve security and standardize on what is enough. Obviously, standards help. We're doing a lot around 62443 to help educate our customers on what we're doing in security. The security capabilities in our products. We were fortunate to have one of the first controllers certified so that we can begin to communicate the capabilities of a product to match the risk associated with that application. And so, by no means is compliance equal to security, but it allows us to have a good conversation, to standardize terms, and to make sure that we're targeting technologies and approaches based on the concerns of that customer. So I think we're going to continue to see risks change based on industry, based on the global economic environment. But hopefully standards will help us stabilize how that conversation is moving forward and make it more effective. Because today I feel like it means many different things to different people.
Yeah, I would add, I think that the threats are increasing. That's the bottom line. In sophistication, in frequency. Initially we was putting a lot of emphasis on ICS targeting from nation-state level adversary groups, but we've seen the evolution of just ransomware in a very short period of time, from going from just untargeted to ICS-specific targeting to now with the threat of releasing sensitive documentation into the public domain if you don't adhere to that ransomware. So there's even more consequences, and that's evolved. That's going to significantly impact manufacturing. And you have to match that. And the good news is that there are a lot of technologies, a lot of services companies out there that can help the companies that are evolving their maturity. CrowdStrike has a comprehensive endpoint detection platform and services. Dragos has a monitoring platform and services. Rockwell's continuously evolving their technology stack to add secure capabilities into the product. So I think the general emphasis is you have to match the adversarial progress, and you have to rectify that or reconcile those gaps across the full suite. Having a understanding of the technology, the services, and the direction, having some planning around that.
I think the last thing I would say to tie a bow on it is just, it really comes down to understanding who you are as a business. What are you produce? Fortunately for us, from a nation state perspective, China pretty much goes out and publishes as part of their planning. These are the things that we're going to target. These are the things that we're going to steal during this period, during this window, right? So if your business is involved in the manufacturing of those specific things, that should elevate that threat level, that threat of those actors, way higher on your priority list, because now you're dealing with nation state grade equipment, process, people, and resources that have basically said, we're going out and actively targeting you. It doesn't mean if you don't fall in those that you shouldn't be aware, but maybe if you don't fall into those, then maybe you want to start looking at, okay, what are the e-crime actors that target the manufacturing side, and really start to to narrow down the scope of what you are trying to defend against. Because again, in a resource-constrained environment where we have limits with what we can do, and most effectively making risk and intelligence-informed, data-driven decisions when it comes to deploying our people, process, and technologies across our security stack really enable us to become better security practitioners, more secure and more mature across the board.
Oh, perfect. Very well said. Thank you all. It is right at the top of the hour here, so I'm going to conclude here with just a few final comments. First of all, thank you to our presenters and to our attendees. There are a number of questions which remain unanswered in the Q&A. We will submit and respond those to you directly. We also have some follow-up resources, both from the CrowdStrike side in terms of our COVID-19 threat brief and center. We've got a specific manufacturing blog kind of out there, which is worth a read, kind of articulating some of Matt Russell's points. Dragos has an excellent 2019 year in review report on the overall threat landscape in ICS and how their instant response practice is managed that. Well worth reading. I made a couple comments from there today. And